He had everything: money, power, a penthouse apartment in Manhattan overlooking Central Park. But that October morning, when he looked back in the Italian marble bathroom mirror, the man he saw wasn't the man he wanted to be. So he did something no one expected. He ran away. He left everything behind and went to the middle of nowhere. And it was there, in the most unlikely place in the world, that he met a young woman who would turn his life upside down. What happened between them that autumn in the countryside is something neither of them could ever forget. And what happened that last night together changed everything forever. If you enjoy true, intense, and exciting stories, stick with me until the end because this one will grab you in a way you don't expect. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take advantage now, because every week there's a new story that will move you. Let's go back to the beginning. His name was Daniel Reed, 38 years old. CEO of a financial technology company he founded himself at 26, at a time when nobody believed in him. Daniel grew up in Brooklyn, the son of a bus driver and a nurse. His childhood wasn't easy. He shared a room with two younger brothers in a cramped apartment where the heating failed every winter. He remembered sleeping in his coat, with his hands in his pockets, promising himself that one day he would escape that life. And he left. Daniel was the type of person who, when he decided on something, saw it through to the end. He studied on a full scholarship, worked as a waiter during college, and slept in the office for the first 2 years of the company. And when success came, it came like an avalanche. In 5 years, his company was worth more than $2 billion. Daniel became a magazine cover star, a speaker at international conferences, and a frequent name on lists of the most influential young people in the country. But what no one saw was what was happening inside. Daniel's routine was like a machine. He woke up at 4:30 in the morning. He checked emails before even brushing his teeth. He drank black coffee without sugar while analyzing reports. By 6, he was already in the car with his driver, speeding through the streets of Manhattan towards his office on Park Avenue. Meetings started at 7 and sometimes didn't end before 10 or at night. He usually ate dinner alone, generally something his assistant ordered through an app. Expensive, tasteless food, which he swallowed without chewing, because his cell phone was always ringing with yet another urgent matter. He didn't have any real friends. He had partners, investors, contacts, people who smiled at him at gala dinners, who toasted with champagne under glass penthouses, but who disappeared when he needed someone to really talk to. He had relationships, of course, beautiful, intelligent, successful women, but none of them stayed, or rather, he didn't let anyone stay, because staying meant stopping, and stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. And Daniel was very afraid of feeling. It was on a Sunday morning that everything changed. Daniel woke up on the bathroom floor of his apartment. He didn't remember how he got there. The last thing he remembered was sitting in the living room armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking at the city below. Millions of lights, millions of lives. And there he was, alone, on the 92nd floor, feeling like he didn't belong to any of it. He stood up slowly. The mirror reflected a man with deep dark circles under his eyes, unshaven and red. He stared at that reflection for a long time, and for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to ask a question he had always avoided. What's the point of all this? That same day, Daniel called his vice president and said he was going to take a month off. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, a nervous laugh. Then questions. Many questions. Daniel answered them all with the same phrase. I need to go away for a while. He didn't know where he was going. He had no plan, no script. He only knew he needed to get out of Manhattan. He needed to get away from the noise, the concrete, the screens, the numbers, the meetings, the fake smiles. He needed silence. He needed air. It was his assistant who found the place. A farm in Vermont. A small, simple place, offering lodging for visitors. Nothing luxurious, no spa or room service. Just an old house surrounded by green fields, mountains in the background, and a silence that Daniel hadn't heard in years. He drove there himself, 6 hours on the road. It was the first time in years that he had driven alone. No driver, no speakerphone conference call, no assistant telling him the day's appointments. Just him, the road, and the sound of the wind coming in through the window. When he arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and the sky seemed painted orange and purple, colors Daniel couldn't remember seeing in a long time. He parked the car in front of a white wooden house with a wide porch and a swing hanging in the corner. There was a red barn further on, chickens pecking in the yard, and the sound of a stream somewhere he couldn't see. Daniel took a deep breath. The air was different. It didn't smell of asphalt, exhaust fumes, or expensive perfume mixed with air conditioning. It smelled of wet earth, grass, something he couldn't name, but which made something inside him relax for the first time in a long time. That was when he saw her for the first time. She emerged from behind the barn carrying a metal bucket. She wore worn jeans, rubber boots, a faded green t-shirt, and her brown hair was tied in a messy ponytail. She had dirt on her hands, dirt on her knees, and when she looked at him, her eyes were the color of dark honey, like the sunset filtered through the whiskey that Daniel used to drink alone on Manhattan nights. She stopped, put the bucket down, and wiped her hands on her pants. "You must be the guest of the city. I am Claire." Her voice was calm, direct, without any ceremony. It lacked the inflection Daniel was used to hearing from people who knew who he was. There was no admiration, no calculated interest. She spoke to him the same way she would speak to anyone who came across her on that dirt road. Daniel extended his hand. "Daniel." She looked at his hand, then at her own hands, dirty with soil, and gave a half smile. "Better not, unless you want to take a little bit of Vermont as a souvenir before you even enter the house." He laughed, and he realized he hadn't laughed like that in months. A genuine laugh, one that came from somewhere inside him that he thought had dried up. Claire was 29 years old. She had inherited her grandfather's farm 3 years earlier when he passed away. Before that, she studied literature at university and worked part-time at a bookstore in Burlington. But when her grandfather died, something changed in her. She left the city, abandoned her plans, and returned to the land where she grew up. She didn't do it out of obligation. She did it out of love. The farm was where she learned to walk, where she rode her first horse, where her grandfather taught her the names of the stars on summer nights. To abandon that place would be like abandoning a part of herself. But running a farm alone wasn't easy. Claire woke up before sunrise. She fed the animals, tended the garden, repaired fences, and negotiated with suppliers in town. She did the work of 3 people and never complained. But Daniel saw in her eyes, when she thought no one was looking, a weariness that went beyond the physical. A weariness of someone who carries the world on their shoulders and pretends everything is all right. In the early days, Daniel didn't know what to do with himself. He woke up early out of habit, but he had no meetings, no urgent emails, no million-dollar decisions to make. He sat on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hands, looking at the fields and feeling a strange anxiety. It was as if his body was waiting for something that wasn't going to happen. On the 3rd day, Claire walked past him on the balcony, carrying a bale of hay that seemed to weigh more than she did. Daniel stood up. "Do you need help?" She stopped, looked him up and down at his Italian leather shoes, at the linen shirt that cost more than she earned in a month, and said, "Do you know how to carry hay?" "No, but I can learn." She was silent for a moment, as if assessing whether he was serious. Then she shrugged. "Okay, but change those shoes first. Otherwise, you'll ruin both of them and there won't be any left." That morning, Daniel carried hay for the first time in his life. His hands were red, his back ached, he sweated like he hadn't since college. But when he finished sitting on the barn floor with Claire beside him, sharing a bottle of water, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of closing a deal or seeing the numbers climb on a spreadsheet. A simple, physical, real satisfaction. The satisfaction of having used his body for something useful, of having felt the real weight of things. Claire looked at him and said, "You're not as useless as you seem." He laughed again, and she did too. From that day on, Daniel began to help on the farm. At first, Claire gave him simple tasks, feeding the chickens, stacking firewood, fetching water from the stream. He did everything wrong at first. He would drop the bucket, scare the chickens, stack the firewood in a way that caused it to collapse 5 minutes later. Claire laughed at him without malice, and then showed him how to do it right, with the patience of someone teaching a child to tie their shoes. And little by little, Daniel learned, not only by doing the farm chores, but by being present, by paying attention, by listening to the birdsong in the morning, feeling the earth in his hands, noticing how the sky changed color throughout the day. He was relearning to use his senses, as if he had spent years sleeping and was finally waking up. Claire was unlike anyone Daniel had ever met. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. He didn't care about brands, status, or how much money someone had in the bank. She judged people by what they did, not what they said. And she had an honesty that sometimes hurt, but which Daniel began to find refreshing after years surrounded by people who only told him what he wanted to hear. One evening, after a long day at work, they were sitting on the porch. The sky was full of stars, more stars than Daniel had ever seen in New York, where the city lights swallowed everything. Claire had brought 2 mugs of tea, and they were there in silence, listening to the crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Daniel looked at her. The moonlight illuminated the outline of her face, casting soft shadows on the curve of her nose and the contour of her lips. She was gazing at the sky with an expression he had never seen on anyone's face in Manhattan. It was peace, a genuine peace, unfiltered, effortless. Claire. She turned to him. Why did you stay here? You could have sold the farm. You could have gone back to the city, pursued your career, had an easier life. She was silent for a moment, twirling the mug between her hands. Because easy isn't the same as good, Daniel. I learned that from my grandfather. He used to say that life isn't about finding the place where everything is simpler. It's about finding the place where everything makes sense. And for me, this makes sense. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest. Not of pain, but of recognition. Because he had spent his entire life not seeking the easiest way, but the most efficient, the most profitable, the most impressive. And at no point had he stopped to ask himself if it made sense. I don't think I've ever found this place, he said, almost in a whisper. Claire looked at him. Her eyes met his and lingered there for a moment that seemed longer than it should have. There was something in that look. Not pity, not judgment. Understanding. As if she could see through all the layers he had built up over the years, the expensive suit, the penthouse apartment, the numbers in the bank, and see the boy from Brooklyn who slept in his coat because the heating didn't work. Perhaps you've already found it, she said. Perhaps you just haven't realized it yet. Then she got up, wished him good night, and went inside, leaving Daniel alone with the stars and a heart beating faster than he cared to admit. The days went by and their routine became second nature, as if it had always been that way. Daniel would wake up early, have coffee with Claire in the kitchen, and the two would go out to tend the farm together. He learned to repair fences with his own hands. He learned to recognize when a cow was sick just by the way it walked. He learned to plant, to harvest, to respect the timing of things, something that seemed impossible in New York, because there everything had to be done yesterday. Claire also gradually opened up. She talked about her mother who left when she was 7 years old. She said she grew up with her grandfather because her father worked on oil platforms and was away for months at a time. She talked about the boyfriend she had in college who left her when she decided to return to the farm, saying she was throwing her life away. He said I was crazy, Claire recounted one afternoon, as the two picked apples in the orchard. He said I was wasting my potential because of sentimentality. And what did you answer? I told him he was right, that I was sentimental, and that was the best thing about me. Daniel stopped picking and looked at her. Claire was at the top of a wooden ladder, the sun behind her, and for a second he lost his breath. Not because she was beautiful, although she was, but because at that moment she seemed so completely herself, so whole, so unafraid to be exactly who she was, that Daniel felt ashamed. Ashamed of all the years he had spent trying to be something else, trying to be more, to be bigger, to be better, without ever stopping to ask himself better for whom. There were moments between them that were wordless, moments when their hands brushed against each other as they reached for the same tool, and neither of them immediately pulled away. Moments when he caught her looking at him when he thought she wouldn't notice, and when their eyes met, she quickly looked away, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. Moments when they were side by side fixing something, their shoulders touching, and that tiny point of contact seemed to warm their entire bodies. Daniel knew what was happening. He was a businessman. He could read people. He could read situations. But this time he didn't want to analyze. He didn't want to calculate risks. He didn't want to think about consequences. For the first time in his life, he just wanted to feel. But there was a shadow. And that shadow was this. Daniel hadn't told Claire who he really was. She knew he was from New York. She knew he worked in business. But she didn't know the magnitude of what he had left behind. She didn't know about the television interviews, the magazine covers, the billions. To Claire, he was just Daniel, a city guy who didn't know how to haul hay but was learning. And Daniel liked that. He liked being just Daniel. He liked being seen for what he did, not for what he had. But he knew that this couldn't last forever. Something happened in the third week. Claire needed to go to town to buy supplies, and Daniel offered to drive. On the way, they stopped at a gas station. Daniel went inside to pay while Claire stayed in the car. Inside the station, the attendant was watching a news program on the small television behind the counter. And suddenly, Daniel's face appeared on the screen. "Billionaire Daniel Reed has been missing for almost 3 weeks," the presenter said. "Sources close to the CEO claim he's on leave for personal reasons, but the prolonged absence is already affecting the company's stock, which has fallen 7% since the announcement." Daniel felt his blood run cold. He paid quickly and left the gas station before the attendant could look at him and the screen at the same time. When Claire returned to her car, she noticed something was different. "Are you okay?" she asked. "That's all. Let's go." But all was not well, because now there was a ticking time bomb. At any moment, someone could recognize him. At any moment, Claire could discover the truth. And Daniel didn't know what scared him more, her discovering who he was, or him having to go back to being who he was. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind in the trees, a dog barking in the distance, the creaking of the old house settling in, simple sounds that had become the soundtrack to his peace, a peace he knew was threatened. He thought about telling her. He thought about sitting with Claire on the porch, looking into her eyes and telling her everything. But he was afraid she would change, afraid she would start treating him differently, like everyone else did, afraid of losing the only person who truly saw him. The following days were the most intense and the most painful, because now Daniel lived each moment with Claire knowing it could be the last moment like that. The last moment she looked at him without knowing, without judging, without putting a number in front of his name. One afternoon, they went to repair a fence on the far side of the property. The work was hard, and the sun was strong. During a break, they sat under a huge oak tree that Claire said was over 100 years old. "My grandfather planted this tree when he was young," she said, leaning against the trunk. "He always said that planting a tree is the most optimistic thing a person can do, because you're planting something that will outlast you. You're telling the future that you believe in it." Daniel looked at the tree, at its enormous branches, at the leaves that glistened in the sun, at the roots that spread across the ground like veins, and he thought about everything he had built, his company, his assets, his reputation. None of it would last like that tree. None of it had real roots. "Claire," he said. And something in his voice must have sounded different, because she turned to him with an attentive, almost worried expression. What it was. He opened his mouth. The words were there, ready. "I need to tell you something." But at that exact moment, his cell phone rang. It was his vice president. The company was in crisis. A regulatory investigation had been opened. Investors were panicking. He needed to go back. Daniel answered the phone and walked away. When he returned, the moment had passed. The bubble had burst. Reality had invaded that place like a bucket of cold water. Claire noticed the change in him immediately. "What happened?" "Problems at work. I might need to leave earlier than I thought." She was silent for a moment. Then he nodded, stood up, and fixed the fence again. But Daniel saw something change in her face. A subtle, almost imperceptible hardening, like someone already bracing herself for a pain she knows is coming. If this story is already getting to you, leave a like and comment below what you think will happen between them. Seriously, I want to know what you're thinking, because what's coming next is unexpected. The next 2 days were strange. Daniel and Claire continued working together, but there was a weight in the air that hadn't been there before. The conversations were shorter, the silences were different. Before, the silences between them were comfortable, full of complicity. Now they were tense, full of unspoken things. Daniel knew it was ending. He could feel the clock ticking. Every hour I received messages from the office. With each message, the reality of New York drew closer, like a wave about to engulf everything. The night before he was due to leave, something happened that would change everything. But before I tell you what happened that night, I need you to understand one thing about Claire. Because this detail changes everything. Claire wasn't just a farmer. She was a woman who had been abandoned many times. By her mother, who left when she was a child. By her father, who was always absent. By her boyfriend, who called her crazy for choosing to stay. Claire had built armor over the years. Armor made of hard work, independence, and never needing anyone. And Daniel, unknowingly, unintentionally, had found a crack in that armor. He had entered through it, slowly, day after day, until he was in a place where, if he left, he would leave a hole she didn't know if she could close. And Claire knew it. And she was afraid. That night, Daniel sat on the balcony for the last time. His suitcase was already packed in the room. The car was parked out front. Tomorrow morning, very early, he would leave. He would return to New York, to the company, to the meetings, to the screens, to the numbers, to the life he had built, and which now seemed to belong to someone else. He heard the door open behind him. Claire came out and sat in the chair beside him. She said nothing. She just sat there, staring into the darkness, at the fields disappearing into the night. They remained like that for a long time. The silence was immense. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than any words. It was the silence of two people who know they are at the end of something that hasn't even truly begun, but that already meant more than anything that came before. Daniel. Her voice was so low it was almost lost in the wind. Try. Who are you really? His heart stopped. He turned to her. Her eyes were fixed on him, gleaming in the dim moonlight. There was no anger in them, no accusation. There was only the question. Direct, honest, like everything that came from Claire. Why are you asking that? Because I'm not stupid. Because of the way you talk, the way you walk, the shoes you brought that cost more than a month's harvest. Because you showed up here out of nowhere without explanation, and now you're getting calls that make you blush. I don't need to know the details. I just need to know one thing. What? This time here. These weeks. You and me, this farm, and these days together. Was it real for you? Or was I just a break between meetings? Her voice didn't tremble, but Daniel saw her hands grip the arms of the chair. He saw her fingers turn white from the force, and he understood that that question was the most vulnerable Claire could be. That question was her taking off all her armor and standing there, unprotected, waiting to see if she would take another blow. Daniel stood up. He took 2 steps toward her. He stood in front of her, looking down into those honey-colored eyes that had changed everything. My name is Daniel Reed. I'm the CEO of a company worth over $2 billion. I live in a $20 million apartment at the top of Manhattan. I have more money than anyone should have. And for the last 12 years, I haven't felt anything, nothing at all. I've been a robot, Claire. A robot in an expensive suit who signed contracts and smiled for cameras and went home every day to an empty apartment where the only sound was the noise of my own failure echoing off the walls. He knelt in front of her, not dramatically, wearily, in the way of someone who has finally stopped running. And then I came here, and I met a woman who taught me how to haul hay, who showed me what the stars look like when you're far enough away from the city to really see them, who told me that easy isn't the same thing as good. And for the first time in over a decade, I felt something. I felt everything. I felt so much that I'm scared because I don't know how to live like this anymore. Feeling things. I've forgotten how." Claire looked at him, and for the first time Daniel saw her eyes fill with tears. Not many. Claire wasn't the type of person who cried easily, but 2 tears trickled down her cheeks, leaving shimmering trails in the moonlight. "Then why are you leaving?" she whispered. "Because I have responsibilities, people who depend on me. A company that's in crisis. I can't just disappear." "I didn't ask you to disappear. I asked if this was real." He took her hand. It was the first time they had truly touched. His hand large with palms now covered in calluses that hadn't existed 3 weeks before. Her hand small, strong, with dirt permanently clinging under her nails. 2 hands so different they seemed from distinct worlds. And they were. But when they touched, Daniel felt as if something finally fell into place. As if a piece that had been missing for years had finally found its place. "That was the most real thing that ever happened to me in my life," he said, and his voice broke on the last word. Claire stared at their intertwined hands. Then she looked at him. And what Daniel saw in those eyes was something that no financial report, no number, no spreadsheet could ever calculate. It was the most complex and simplest equation in the universe. 2 people who met at the wrong time, in the right place, and who now had to decide what to do with something neither of them had planned. Claire raised her free hand and touched his face. Her fingers were rough, calloused, and against his skin they felt as textured as the earth itself. She traced the line of his jaw slowly, as if memorizing every contour. "You are the most complicated person I have ever met, Daniel Reed," she said. "And you are the simplest person, in the best possible way." She gave a half smile. That same half smile from the first day, when he held out his hand, and she showed him her palms, dirty with soil. But now that smile had layers. It had 3 weeks of mornings together and afternoons in the orchard and nights on the porch. It had hay loaded and fences repaired and stolen glances. It had everything they hadn't said during all that time finally overflowing. Daniel leaned in, slowly, giving her time to back away, to move away, to say no. But she didn't back away. She stood there, her eyes open, watching him approach, and when his lips were an inch from hers, she closed her eyes. The kiss was slow. There was no rush. It wasn't the kind of kiss Daniel knew in New York. Hurried kisses at parties, calculated kisses on dates, kisses that were more performance than feeling. This kiss was like Claire herself, honest, direct, real. It tasted of chamomile tea in a cold night and something Daniel could only describe as home. When they parted, their foreheads touched, breathing the same air, their eyes still closed, as if opening them would break the spell. "And now?" she asked. "I don't know." "For the first time, the CEO doesn't have a plan?" He chuckled softly. "For the first time, the big CEO doesn't want a plan. He just wants to stay here." "But you can't." "I know." She stepped back. She stood up. She took a deep breath like someone preparing to plunge into cold water. "So go ahead. Solve what you need to solve. And when you solve it, if you still want to, if it still makes sense to you when you're back on top of that building looking down at the city, I'll be here. Where I've always been. Where I'll always be." She turned and went inside. The door closed slowly, and Daniel stood there kneeling on the porch with the taste of her on his lips and the absolute certainty that he had just experienced the most important moment of his life. Daniel left the next morning before sunrise. He left a note on the kitchen table, just 2 lines. "Thank you for showing me the stars. I'll be back." He drove back to New York in a state he couldn't quite define. It was as if a part of him had stayed on that farm, as if he were splitting in 2 as the car drove away down the roads of Vermont. When he arrived in Manhattan, it was like entering a world that was no longer his. The noise, the honking horns, people walking fast, looking down at their cell phones, at nothing in particular. The high-speed elevator that climbed 92 floors in less than a minute. The apartment that cost a fortune, and now seemed emptier than ever. He resolved the company's crisis. It took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of intense meetings, negotiations with regulators, phone calls with investors, sleepless nights. He did what he always did, worked until it was resolved. But this time it was different. This time, in the middle of a meeting about compliance and regulation, he looked out the window and saw green fields where there was only concrete. He saw a white wooden house where there were only skyscrapers. He saw honey-colored eyes where there were only reports. 2 weeks. And when everything was resolved, when the company stabilized and investors calmed down and the stock started to rise again, Daniel did something that shocked everyone. He called the board of directors for an extraordinary meeting. Everyone expected yet another strategic plan, another brilliant move from the genius who had built that empire. But Daniel entered the room, looked at each of the faces around the table and said, "I'm going to step away. Not for a month. Indefinitely. Marcus will take over as interim CEO. The company is solid, the team is ready, and I need to go." The silence in the room was deafening. "Go where?" someone asked. Daniel smiled. And it was that smile he had learned on the farm. A smile without calculation, without strategy, without ulterior motives. Home. He drove 6 hours back to Vermont. It was late afternoon when he arrived. The sun was setting exactly as it had on the first day. Orange and purple, like a painting someone had made just for him. He parked in front of the white wooden house. He got out of the car, and there she was, on the porch, in the same worn jeans, the same rubber boots, the same honey-colored eyes. But this time she was standing there, arms crossed, looking at him with an expression that mixed surprise, relief, and something Daniel refused to call anything other than love. "You're back," she said. "I said I would come back." People say a lot of things, Daniel. He walked to the balcony. He stopped in front of it. He took a small envelope from his coat pocket and handed it over. "What is that?" "Open." She opened it. Inside was a seed, an acorn. Claire looked at the seed. Then she looked at him. And her eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't fight them. "Your grandfather said that planting a tree is the most optimistic thing a person can do," Daniel said, "because it's telling the future that you believe in it. I want to plant this tree with you, Claire. I want to stay here and watch it grow. I want to put down roots. For real. For the first time in my life." Claire descended the steps to the porch. She stopped in front of him. She held the seed in one hand and his face in the other. "You're going to have to learn how to fix fences properly," she said, "because yours are still terrible." He laughed. She laughed. And he kissed her again, there in the middle of the yard, with the chickens pecking around and the sun setting behind the mountains, and the stream singing in the distance that ancient song that the earth sings to those who stop running long enough to listen. Daniel Reed did not return as CEO, at least not in the way it was before. He restructured his stake in the company, retained a seat on the board, but worked remotely from a wooden table in the kitchen of a farmhouse in Vermont, where the only background noise was the sound of the wind and sometimes Claire's voice humming as she tended the garden. He used some of his money to help modernize the farm. He bought equipment, improved the infrastructure, but always respecting Claire's way of doing things. He never tried to turn the farm into a corporate business. He learned that some things are more important than efficiency. Some things need to be slow. They need to have the rhythm of the land, the sun, the seasons. Claire and Daniel planted the oak sapling together one November afternoon in a spot Claire had chosen, near her grandfather's oak tree. She said that way the two trees could keep each other company. Daniel knelt on the ground, dug the hole with his hands, placed the sapling inside and carefully covered it. Claire poured water on it, and the two of them stood there, looking at that small mound of earth, knowing that something was beginning there that would last much longer than they did. "Do you think she'll grow up?" Daniel asked. Claire took his hand, her hand, small and strong. His hand, now with real calluses. "Go. Everything grows when you stop rushing." He looked at her honey-colored eyes, at the smile that had changed his life, at the woman who had made the Brooklyn billionaire realize that the most valuable thing he had ever owned hadn't cost him a penny. "I love you, Claire." It was the first time he had said that to someone, and he truly felt every word. She shook his hand. "I know. I love you too. Even though you're terrible at stacking firewood." He laughed. She laughed. And the sound of their laughter mingled with the wind and the birds and the creek and all the sounds of that place that Daniel Reed, the boy from Brooklyn who slept in his coat, the CEO who lived on the 92nd floor, the man who thought he felt nothing anymore, could finally call home. Some people spend their entire lives building empires, accumulating numbers, climbing floors, and they forget that the ground, the real ground, the one that sustains everything, is always below, waiting. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is not to conquer more. It is to stop, look around, and realize that everything he ever needed was in a simple, quiet place, with real stars in the sky and the hand of someone who sees him as he truly is. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories. Comment below what you would do in Daniel's place. Would you have the courage to give up everything for love? I really want to know. And don't forget to watch the next story that's appearing on your screen now, because I guarantee it's just as intense as this one. See you there.